Thanks, Michael. It's a fantastic pleasure to be here to share with the bus community what we've been doing at ITLS over the past several years around intelligent mobility and also mobility as a service, and particularly share with you some of our recent research work, survey findings both on the demand and supply side, and reflect on how and what this might mean for the bus and coach industry in Australia and New Zealand. So there's a couple of sections to my talk today. I want to start off by, again, just given all this dogma, and I feel like I'm preaching to converted here, which is good. All this dogma and a lot of misuse around the terminology. So I want to really go back to basics around what we really mean when we talk about mobility as a service. Then I want to share some market insights from some a demand study that we also did. ITSA also did one, and a number of other people around the world, different groups, have been doing this sort of work. But also, more importantly, looking at the service delivery side, looking at the supply side, and we believe this is one of our major contributions, major core innovations in this space, and finally reflect and look at some next steps in this area as well. So, one of the things that has been occurring as the MaaS concept goes up the hype curve is people have been confounding mobility as a service with mobility services. And there's 35 these shared mobility providers, transportation network companies, what you want to call it, providing ride sharing, car sharing, bike sharing, on-demand buses even, who claim to be MaaS providers, when we talk about MaaS, they're really just one constituent component of the whole MaaS ecosystem, the vision that we have. And the same holds true for mobility technologies as well. These new digital platforms, for instance, which bring together demanders and suppliers, it's very important, but it's one part of what we all mean when we talk about MaaS. And electrification and autonomous vehicles are very important as well. And one of the major concerns is there's obviously a lot of benefits from all of these, both individually as services or technologies, but also collectively, but equally so a lot of realities that we mustn't forget, a lot of potential to generate unintended consequences that could compromise the ideals for sustainable cities. And we heard about some of these lies that Graham talked about. And there's been a lot of kind of modeling and scenario work done looking at what it might all mean for our cities, for congestion, for urban form, from a lot of the kind of futures that people have been proposing around these shared mobility modes displacing fixed route public transport, and a lot of it coming to the spatial efficiency argument that I'm sure you've all seen time and time again. And also around modal convergence, the idea that these robo-taxis might eliminate congestion, which is a big myth, as you know. And I want to motivate these issues with what I call a modal efficiency framework by looking at every mode. It really is an intersection of space and time, and we have all our both spatially and temporally efficient modes. Our public transport modes we can put in a quadrant there. The most successful as a service kind of mode so far. And all the private modes as well, been very temporally inefficient, idle around 95% of the time, seating around 1.1 people per car, very low occupancies. And these shared modes that are coming online, and I say sharing because there's two types of sharing. There's sharing across time, which I think they're pretty good at because that's a simultaneous sharing, so you're not owning the assets anymore. So there's huge opportunities there. I don't have a problem with that. But sharing across space, they're not doing very well. The simultaneous sharing element, they're very low, and we heard less than one person per car in the car sharing and ride sharing scenarios when we factor in all the repositioning trips that they do. And for completeness, we have our active modes on the top as well. So if we think about where our cities are now, in private car-first cities, in Australian cities, in North American cities, for instance, the center of mass is really on that bottom left, on all of those private modes. And we think under mobility as a service, that's not going to change too much. We want to bring together all the temporally efficient modes across a range spatial efficiencies. We want to deploy them where it's most geographically suitable. But we think in cities like Australian cities, public transport still wouldn't be where we might want it to be. So a MaaS deployment in this case might have a lot more personalized modes, the kind with access through car share, for instance. But it might make it more palpable through first and last mile integration to help boost public transport patronage. Now, in public transport first cities, in European cities and a lot of the Asian developed cities, it's a very different world where most people use public transport already, so they're already accessing mobility as a service. So we often wonder what is the point there, and it might very well be the case under MaaS that you're actually switching people away from these public modes onto these less spatially efficient shared modes. And of course, the worst case scenario is where we just have all these very spatially intensive modes that will dominate in the future. So mobility as a service, we've looked at the modes. It's got to bring together public transport at its core and shared mobility modes, all the ones where you access as a service. But also, and this forms a big glue for it to bring together and to make it work really seamlessly, is these mobility technologies. But I add a fourth component, which is often forgotten, is the notion that we will need an institutional overlay, I think, to help regulate for and to control for that modal mix, some of those issues that might emerge, and also to ensure fair competition in the market, and potentially also as a clearinghouse mechanism to help optimize for network efficiency, sort of putting a road user charge embedded if everyone is accessing mobility as a service. So again, the premise is about moving away from asset ownership to access on demand. And so it's not just a technology or a product, it's an entire vision for our cities. And sadly, a lot of the profit-driven kind of firms out there are forgetting that. But I do know a lot of the industry bodies, the MaaS Alliance, for instance, and I think bus associations might want to get involved in this too, is really thinking through a lot of these strategic issues as well. Now, at ITLS, we like to think of the 3 Bs when it comes to the design and implementation of mobility as a service. The first one around bundles, which are these packages that end users subscribe, budgets around end user preferences, and also on the supplier interface around brokers or aggregators, which bring together a range of different service suppliers, whether they're mode-specific operators like yourselves, like bus operators, or they can be non-mobility providers, vehicle manufacturers, tech providers, financial enterprise, for instance, anyone with an interest in future mobility that want to be part of that broker or aggregator model. And they, in turn, these brokers in turn repackage them and value add by providing that integrating function to sell as integrated mobility packages to demanders. And that's the 2 facets of research that we have been doing. And of course, once we can combine those together to determine what the free market, the market equilibrium is, we can evaluate and see what kind of institutional overlay government might want to add in to help control and help meet and deliver on the strategic vision for our cities. So I'll speak briefly on that first phase, on the demand interface that we looked at. So we undertook this study early in 2017. It was just in Sydney, and it was a very sophisticated survey instrument, and we undertook face-to-face interviews with more than 252 respondents. It took about half an hour for each one to get an understanding in terms of what the market is willing to subscribe to. So this is an example of a choice task screen that we give. So we offer different mobility packages, bundles. There's the public transport, car share, taxi, Uber pool, and questions around whether the credit might roll over or not. We tested both pay-as-you-go schemes and also subscription schemes. And we actually found subscription to be more popular, which is quite interesting. And we think this might be related to some of the quantity discounts that we designed within it. And also an opportunity for people to design their own mobility package that might be acceptable to them. And we looked at different markets for where these MaaS products are most acceptable, most popular. And we found that infrequent users of cars, people that might just be driving as a first and last mile to go to the station, or people that use public transport generally and then only drive on the weekends. So linking back to that whole temporal efficiency argument, we found them to be, people don't want to buy an expensive asset and use it only on occasions. We found them to have the highest propensity to subscribe, much more than sole public transport users and also non-public transport users, sole car drivers. But on average, we find around 47% of our respondent sample are likely to subscribe to these products. And we also estimate willingness to pay from some very advanced modeling work that we do in terms of the worth of each mobility entitlement. So an hour of access to car share around $6.40, slightly less than the go-get price. So a days of unlimited access to public transport, a little under $6, much less than the present Opal day cab, which we find very interesting. So it's very useful to know this, because this can help any interested party, might be you guys in the audience, in terms of delivering these products that are really popular for the public, have the highest chance of success. But understanding the demand side is one thing. We've also been doing a lot of work around that service delivery side, looking at the supply side of the market. And this links a lot, especially in the bus industry, with the future of bus contracts. And a lot of the developments that's been happening in the past several years are quite linked to this. So all the on-demand trials that are happening in New South Wales, for instance, or quite a rudimentary implementation of that broker model in terms of having an incumbent supplier of transport, a bus operator, partnering with a tech provider. Also, multimodal contracts. Newcastle, the first of such scheme in Australia, is on the right track there. Region 6, for instance, bringing fixed route and on-demand buses into one contract offering, really trying to offer an integrated service is another step forward. And also in Melbourne, amongst a rail operator, where I think only 7% of the population in Melbourne actually can walk to a train station. There's a lot of interest in access contracts around how can you put car sharing and bike sharing, for instance, and integrate it as part of the single offering for users. So we think the present area-specific, output-based, delivering kilometers on defined vehicle types, these sort of contracts will evolve in the future, following these trends to mode-agnostic, outcome-based contracts where you deliver accessibility and the broker can use any vehicle of their choosing that they think is more appropriate. And to test the supply side, we designed these mobility contracts, and I spent a lot of time towards the end of last year in the Nordic countries, in Finland, in Sweden, doing in-depth interviews with some of the MaaS operators or pilot operators up there, and also the regulators to try and determine what kind of contract might be sensible, and what are the important elements that we should put into that contract. And of course, we run a Threadbow conference series on competition and ownership, where we did some participatory research there. And this is a survey instrument that we designed and programmed around this whole concept of mobility contracts. And here's an example screen in terms of what we would pose to the respondent. We have different mobility contract options that we ask, and a no-choice option, you don't have to subscribe. And also all of these are defined by attributes, including, for instance, the revenue mix coming from each mode, public transport, on-demand, car share, taxi. Government support as well, both strategic support and also financial monetary support through subsidies. Return on investment, and we capture risk and variance there as well. And business branding, bus operators have told us that that's really important for them, and equity contribution, and we can condition that according to the size of the business. And we have two choice responses around investing. So that means becoming a financial shareholder without contributing any assets, and also supplying in these contracts, which might be more of an opportunity for bus operators to actually put in vehicles, put in infrastructure like your depots, put in personnel, experienced personnel as well as part of the MaaS business proposition. So we've run the survey for 5 months now. I closed it about a week or two ago, very recently, and have received immense support from a lot of people, including in the room, from Michael, from BIC, a lot of the state associations that have helped me with outreach as well. So really delighted to receive that support from you guys. It was a global survey, so we covered pretty much all the developed countries around the world. Around 46% came from Australasia, and also a mix from other continents as well to give us that global perspective in markets that we think are quite sensible, and there's a level of comparability there. So the respondent sample, we had around half mode-specific operators and another half being those non-mobility providers as well. As you can see, across small, medium, and large businesses, small being less than 1,000 staff, and large more than 10,000 staff. So obviously a lot easier to access respondents in small businesses making those investment decisions. Now I want to hone in a bit on the operator sample mix. We got 15 from New South Wales, 8 actually from Victoria, and pretty much, and a few from New Zealand as well, but pretty much covered all the national operators in Australia. And these are the mix from some of the other continents as well. And in terms of the people that, it's quite, you don't see this kind of methodology in terms of stated choice applied on the supply side very much, because it's hard. It's not like a consumer panel where you can give people gift vouchers to participate, for instance. So we're very grateful for all the very senior people in business that offered up, I estimate, more than hundreds of hours in valuable time to provide input in our research. And most of them, as you can see, were CEOs, MDs, directors, managers, people, very important people, making investment decisions in these companies. So I'll go through some of our results. We find, firstly, that fixed route public transport is quite important. We find on average people prefer 25 to 35% of the revenue coming from fixed route public transport, which is quite encouraging in terms of some of the modal concerns that we might be concerned about. The return on investment we find is the expectations are much higher for investors than suppliers. And the value of the business proposition is a lot bigger in non-mobility providers than mode-specific operators, almost double, in fact. And on average, people didn't want to monopolize, as it turns out. People are happy to perhaps contribute a 35% equity stake into these MaaS broker businesses, very happy to work with partners in delivering these services. In terms of return on investment, we find that, on average, the respondent sample, they're very happy to accept around 6 to 8% of a return. So higher than what they said was the risk-free rate, but much lower than what they stated is the expectation in terms of going about new business ventures or contract opportunities. In terms of stakeholder support for MaaS initiatives, it's quite interesting that there's more support from smaller organizations than large organizations who often have maybe a research division looking into future mobility, things like that. And especially in non-mobility providers, it turns out that shareholder support might be a bit of an issue for them. So in terms of some of the modeling that we run, and in terms of what are the attributes that people find are important in terms of these MaaS broker businesses, most of them turned out to be significant, which is very encouraging in terms of showing that the results make sense. We find that there's some differences between Australasian businesses and overseas businesses in terms of whether government support is important, more important for Australians and New Zealanders. There are differences in the uncertainty in the rate of return, for instance, much more important for suppliers than investors who might be more accustomed to carrying risk, I think. And branding turned out to be a bit more marginal than we initially thought to be the case. Quite a lot are happy to actually use someone else's brand and do a new brand, actually, than the existing brand. Maybe it's a risk management issue as well. And also, in terms of differences there, in terms of total value of the business and proportion equity and voting rights. And we can use a lot of these results to help us estimate willingness to pay for different contract elements. So to interpret this, for instance, the value of an extra percentage of fixed route public transport revenue is around 6.7 million US dollars to invest, but 18.5 to supply. And we see for taxi and ride-hailing services, it's actually very marginal, actually negative for taxis in this instance, which we think is quite encouraging in terms of that concern about them being overwhelming amount of personalized point-to-point services. Government subsidy is much less important than the government strategic support, and we think that's because people want government involvement, but at arm's length, not necessarily they're telling them the ins and outs, day-to-day operation type issues. And there's quite an element of risk aversion as well in terms of the smaller equity contribution being preferred. So you can see it's negative at the bottom. And we can use these results to help price potential mobility broker aggregator businesses. So these are the ones that I showed earlier were averages as in terms of being the most popular that were picked. And on average, and these are lifetime figures, so say over 10-year horizon, these are businesses worth 70 to 100 million US dollars, and you're putting in 35% as well. So I don't know if that's sensible, and I'd love to have a talk over the next couple of days with you guys in terms of that. Now, I hope it is sensible and it makes some sense, because I know with things that don't exist, we resort to these kind of stated preference methodology, which comes with all sorts of limitations. And we know a lot about these in terms of hypothetical bias, and we try and design it in a way, and it's very sophisticated in a way where we try to control for all of those. But some of the survey feedback that we got was very encouraging, and we hope that it added value for our participants as well, in terms of, for a UK operator said it helped them think through the business partners that they might consider. Not easy, I recognize that. Deep and pointed, well done, Yale. I thought that was really nice. And the scenarios were interesting as well. And also in terms of business investment feedback, a number of issues emerged. So corporate might be on board, for instance, but not other business units. So people may be struggling in terms of working outside the traditional business domain that they're allowed to work in. So government contracts, if your sole customer is the government, that is a big issue, and we've talked about all these limitations in terms of present contract scenario, in terms of vehicle types and contract boundaries, and how. And I think it's a question for all bus operators, how you can actually diversify and have other customers as well. Now the third one, in terms of a taxi operator, they're only interested if there's taxis in the mix. So obviously it's a hypothesis we've been testing, and it turns out to be it is a bit of an issue that there's that bias there, and your current business base being eroded. That fear of cannibalizing your existing business, and also the fear of being cannibalized, is a big issue as well. And in terms of the MaaS ecosystem, and I couldn't agree with this more, we need more examples and proof of concept projects. Trust emerged as a big issue, both with customers, that fear of losing the customer, and strongly linked to brand value, but some businesses would rather work in that B2B space than B2C, and also particularly from government, who really worry about losing control, losing that ownership, losing that interface with the customer. And we find that as there's an element of regret that in some of the reforms that's happened in Finland as well. So some concept-related barriers, no risk takers, the economic sustainability of some of this, particularly in that subscription model, I think, which is based on quantity discounts. I mean, if it's an initially subsidized trial, it's fine, but at the end of the day, later, where is that extra money actually going to come from? So that's quite an issue. So I'm often asked what our studies, what our results, what does it mean for bus operators? How can bus operators prepare? How can they adapt? What it might mean for different operators in different market segments. So I pose that to you, a $40 million investment in a one-third stake of a MaaS business. Is that acceptable for you guys? And I think it's quite different for operators in different contexts. For metropolitan ones, there's a lot of cutthroat competition, but also huge opportunities, because that's where it's all happening. In rural and regional, it'll be a different modal mix. We see in my framework already, it's a spectrum, so there'll be a different modal mix in there, but also less barriers in terms of partners and other parties there. And in school and charter, I think there's a lot of opportunities to use a lot of these underutilized assets that I know are out there to at the margin, especially linked to a modal capacity shortfall. How do you guarantee that minimum level service guarantee for customers that subscribe to the plan? And in government, there's always a tension between soliciting ideas and awaiting market-led proposals. And in bus operators, and we see a number of different mindsets from different operators, and actually run what's called a latent class model to try and tease some of that out. There's that don't believe mindset, don't believe in the whole concept and turn a blind eye to it. There's wait and see, and a lot of open innovation as well. And we often see it's those that outperform the rest. But ultimately, I think you can't just be excellent bus operators anymore. And I know you all are, that's why you're here, but also helping to drive innovation in the sector is very important too. So I'm going to finish off on some next steps and some promotion, if I may, as well. So again, thank you to all in the bus industry that have invested time to support our research. And I found out I'm very good at annoying people to getting them to do our survey. We know that there's a lot of survey fatigue in the bus industry. And what we will be doing is distributing a fact sheet of all of our findings to all the participants and interested parties as well. And so now we've got the demand side, we're doing the supply side now, and we're going to put that together to form that market-led equilibrium, which we plan in a phase 3 kind of work to bring to government and help design the institutional overlay, the regulatory regime that might be consistent with the urban efficiency goals of cities. On Wednesday, I want to encourage you to come to my talk, which is on the state of the industry, Wednesday, 10:30 a.m., on vital statistics and strategic outlook. And as part of that work with BIC, as partners with ITLS, we're actually doing a BIC industry census. And I think there's not been a lot of responses. So I'd encourage people to take a look at that if they can. And also we'll be talking about our latest work on bus rapid transit and branded bus services as well. Metro Bus, B-Line, Smart Bus. And we actually found a way to rank all of the services in Australia, and I think the results will be really surprising for you guys. We're running, many of you are involved and many of you know about our Threadbow Conference series, the world's premier conference on competition and ownership. So next year is our 32nd year now in Singapore, first time ever in an Asian country. So we co-host that with LTA and NTU, and Tower Transit is a conference sponsor as well. And there's a lot of excellent workshops, and we invite people to take a look at the website, and a lot of interest in emerging business models and also disruptive transportation as well. And more for our New South Wales colleagues is the Certificate of Transport Management that we run in July every year. And there's scholarships out there for the community transport sector. So please take a look at that. And this is our public transport research team led by our founding director, David Henshaw. And we'll have some new faces. John Nelson, who's joining us from the UK as the future chair, as new chair in public transport. So you'll be seeing him active a lot more in the bus industry in Australia. And that's where I will finish off. So thank you all.